Thank you. So I will look through this with some context first. I think that's important, especially as a practitioner. I am not a researcher. I read it as a business user, discussed some of the concepts at a high level with some of my CIOs and heads of IT or business leaders that I was out with in advance of this, just trying to get their sense. But I think it's also very important as a practitioner to have some background as to where I'm coming from, because this is all about my reading of this paper based on personal experience. And so that experience is 7 years in Toronto dealing with what would fit in the framework of mid and large enterprises, and several of those global. The last 3 years is significantly informed by spending time more in Southwest Ontario, where it's predominantly the mid-sized organizations and a few small, with a handful of large from my personal experience. So I do see it across the gamut, tends to be heavily biased towards the Canadian scene. At the same time, I'm not a mathematician, and I did leave the accounting side of the professional services, because when I did cash, I could get us 7 different answers in an hour. So I was looking at it from a, how could I use this practically every day, and does it appear sound? I'm not going to go through the 3 points that were there. This is just a summary. At the end of the day, when I read the paper, overall, it felt informed with my broader international experience and sometimes belied my local Southwest Ontario provincial experience. And I think that does make sense given that this was focused on the Australian marketplace or entities that were based in Australia. And at the same time, I'm not surprised by it, because I actually reach out to South Africa and Australia as a practitioner often and have people transfer, and their experience would support this at a professional level. Overall, thank you, first off, for doing the research. This corroboration and risk management in IT, I think, is highly relevant. And I can tell you, having just left a partners conference with our firm, it's interesting, because at the end of the day, you'll see some of the points I talk about here, I don't hear my clients talking about. But what did I hear at the partners conference from our clients? The risk of disruptive technology on their operations in the next 1 to 5 years, and risk management being top of mind. So how can information technology governance and risk management and its correlation not be of practical relevance to those organizations? So this was very timely from my perspective. Overall, the intended audience of the paper, it is very good. I would have a hard time presenting it to some of my clients because it is a research-based paper, but the importance of the key messages in that paper I think are highly relevant to them, and just in discussing it with them would benefit from having a 1 to 2 page business article somewhere in a journal someday for business use, because this is operationally imperative to them. The research approach made sense to me, and I struggled. I wanted more as a practitioner. I wanted to almost get out and audit the results, but then I put on my practical hat and say, how do I actually do that, and how do I get a global analysis of that? That becomes a practical challenge, but it still leaves me wanting for a bit more substantive information, and that really comes from doing benchmarking and analytics and knowing that even the individuals doing assessment can sometimes have different answers, especially if there's multiple assessors in the process. So getting to that gives you more evidence that leads the business leaders to make a decision and move in the right direction, but the cost, effort, and time of that, there is a finite trade-off. Looking at the categorization of the entities, certainly made sense to me. There certainly seemed to be an implied CIO or equivalent role in one of the 2 organizations. When I look at my experience in Canada and in Ontario, that would belie my personal experience, simply because of about 250 clients I have today. I would say less than 30 of them have something they would call a CIO or equivalent. It's amazing how many of them have at best an IT manager, and that puts them in a position where it's hard to have governance because they're not at the table of having a voice with any of the other executives. Many of them would appreciate something like this as one more piece of evidence to show them how they can deliver value to the overall business organization. Frameworks. So the highest awareness of project frameworks, this was very interesting for me because Project management, when I go out and talk to those, especially managers of IT that I mentioned that were not CIOs, these CIOs are much more aware, almost in alignment with the different models and the ranking of the models that were there. When I get into the IT managers who are the heads of these departments, predominantly they either come from business trying to implement a project, or they come from successful project implementations and have a deep awareness of frameworks like Prince, some of them Val IT, but more often not Prince and the PMBOK methodologies. Very low awareness of anything like COSO and low awareness of COBIT. ISO they would also tend to shy away with. In fact, I have conversations with 10 top clients of my practice in Southwest Ontario, and only one of them actually wants to engage in a discussion about any of the ISO, be they governance or cyber frameworks, given the perceived burden of aligning to that. Now, they're not even looking at becoming ISO certified. They're just looking at it as a framework, and they see it as cumbersome. And I think that comes down to not understanding all of these and not being in a position where they can talk to the value. This also aligns to the overall view of the ISO. I would say in my experience, I have very few clients that actually do look to the ISO standard as a definition. More often than not, if they're willing to define IT governance, which is actually a rarity, more often than not, they actually point to the ITGI's definition or something within COBIT as they've become more and more aligned. The human element was absolutely not surprised by this. People everything up because we exist and we're different, right? And so seeing that as an actual challenge of all people different playing together and trying to get to something that not every organization has defined, we all come with different understandings of, and we have the biases of our past experiences, certainly made sense to me and is proven in the daily life of trying to help organizations overcome their challenges. It's pretty easy to implement or define a process and buy technology if you've got the resources, but making those people change their behaviors, understand and buy in is the biggest. So at its highest level, overall, I did find the paper to be very useful. I've used it at a high level, and I'm actually looking at some ongoing IT governance audits right now where I've kind of informed my team about what we're finding in some of these results, especially relevant because they tend to be in the public sector right now. So given some of the respondents here, there's actually alignment, and my clients really love to see comparison to other organizations, be they national or international. That said, I certainly would love to see this beginning expanded from a practical point of view, because it's not something everybody can do. And quite often, I may have a gut feeling that how important this is. I may have some experiential, but it's always nice to be supported by something that is not backed just by Christopher or backed just by PwC or any other firm, but is actually backed by independent, objective research. Also, the categorization of small, mid, large certainly makes sense to me, and I think it needs to be looked at from a global perspective, if at all possible, in future research opportunities. But at the same time, just understanding my personal experience and the results of this paper led me to wonder, how does one do that? By defining revenues or people-based organizational sizes and geopolitical, socio-cultural considerations of each of the entities or each of the countries wherein the research may be adopted, is the 50-person or 200-person retail organization that I can compare across Canada the same as the entity of similar size and revenues in Australia, in Central Europe, in Asia? I don't know the answer, but it did cause me some concern to say, how do we find, as we broaden a study like this, comparators that actually allow the users who are going to someday embark upon leveraging this comparative information that makes sense to them and is actually applicable. Again, probably a high bias as a professional practitioner, very interested in how the statements of individuals responding to a survey such as this are corroborated, defined, because you can ask me a similar question, and if you ask it to me 2 months apart, I might have a subtly different answer which leads to a different outcome. If it gets more concrete, and I have to substantiate that through some valuation or through some evidence, absolutely becomes a higher benchmark. But there is a cost, time, effort, and an ability to conduct that research. So the closer you get to that bar, the bigger value it provides, but nobody can absolutely meet that bar either, I recognize. And then some other thoughts that it really led me to. And this just comes from walking the halls of different clients and, quite frankly, several different industries where I was part of the organization, not a professional services firm, but also walking the halls of 4 very large professional services firms. I wonder how much of the experience of the respondents is informed and they have governance because they're board members. And the constitution of those board members brings with it an expectation given experiences those board members have at other organizations. You know, when I walk around Southwest Ontario, I'm always amazed at I walk into an organization that I absolutely do not think will have a discussion about IT governance or governance at all. And they are having it, and it's changed in 1 year because of the introduction of new board members who have this as a lively discussion in larger, in this circumstance, publicly traded Canadian or UWCISA entities come into a small private entity that is still 500 employees making all kinds of revenue, but historically hasn't had those discussions. The discussion begins in those instances because of the introduction of these new leaders. And how does that play out in mid-size versus large organizations? How does that play out as you have CIOs with past experiences? So what was really interesting to me was, could I ever understand this research and how much it was brought to bear because of the experiences of board members, executives, or CIOs from past experiences bringing it in? Because if I'm working with organizations, it helps to be able to say, you don't want to always create the solution or the talent that you need. Sometimes it's best to acquire it from an individual and bring it in. It's not organic growth is not always the best answer. Bringing it in can be a better value, and then working it through organically at that point. So at its highest level, I am very appreciative of the research being conducted. There are some challenges with it, but I haven't seen anything in the world that doesn't have its own challenges. Based on the limitations described in the report, I fully agree. And I think this is actually practical research. I'd like to see more, but it is practical research that I can take and use in a day-to-day based organization.